Over the years, several times we had Dr. Jim Boyce preach here. Great, great servant of God, great scholar, preacher, monumental life. And his books are still a blessing to me. I certainly considered him a mentor. In fact, R.C. Sproul told me one day that the death of Jim Boyce was God's judgment on America. He has left a huge hole. Boyce, who loves hymns and wrote hymns, wrote in one of his books about John Newton. It was 1779 when John Newton wrote Amazing Grace, which we all know. But I don't know if you know the whole story of this man born in 1725 who died in 1807. Let me just read you a little of what Boyce wrote about him. Newton was raised in a Christian home in which he was taught verses of the Bible. But his mother died when he was only 6 years old, and he was sent to live with a relative who hated the Bible and mocked Christianity. Newton ran away to sea. He was wild in those years and was known for being able to swear for 2 hours without ever repeating himself. He was forced to enlist in the British Navy, but he deserted, was captured, and beaten publicly as a punishment. Eventually, Newton got into the merchant marine and went to Africa. In his memoirs, he wrote that when he went to Africa, he went for one reason only, quote, that I might sin my fill. Newton fell in with a Portuguese slave trader in Africa, in whose home he was cruelly treated. This man often went away on slaving expeditions, and when he was gone, his power passed to his African wife, the chief woman of his harem. She hated all white men and vented her hatred on poor Newton. He says that for months he was forced to grovel in the dirt, eating his food from the ground like a dog. He was beaten mercilessly if he touched it. That is, he had to eat it with his face and not his hands. In time, thin and emaciated, Newton made his way to sea, where he was picked up by a British ship making its way up the coast to England. When the captain of the ship learned that the young man knew something about navigation as a result of being in the British Navy, he made him his ship's mate. But even then, Newton fell into trouble. One day when the captain was ashore, Newton broke out the ship's supply of rum and got the whole crew drunk. He was so drunk himself that when the captain returned and struck him on the head, Newton fell overboard and would have drowned if one of the sailors hadn't quickly hauled him back on board. Near the end of one voyage, as they were approaching Scotland, the ship ran into bad weather, was blown off course. Water poured in, the ship began to sink. The young profligate was sent down into the hold to pump water. Storm lasted for days. Newton was terrified. He was sure the ship would sink and he would drown. But in the hold of the ship, as he desperately pumped water, the God of all grace, whom he had tried to forget but who had never forgotten him, brought to his mind Bible verses he had learned in his home as a child. The way of salvation opened up to him. He was born again in the hold of the ship. He was deeply transformed, and much later, when he was again in England, Newton began to study theology, eventually became a preacher, first in a little town called Olney and later in London. Of this storm, William Cowper, really the very unique British poet, who became a fast personal friend of Newton and lived with him for several years, wrote this. Cowper wrote about the storm in which God called Newton. This is what he wrote. You'll remember these words. God moves in a mysterious way, his wonders to perform. He plants his footsteps in the sea and rides upon the storm. And so he does, says Boyce. Newton was a great preacher of grace, for he had learned that where sin increased, grace abounded all the more. He is proof that the grace of God is sufficient to save anybody, and that he saves them by grace alone. And now you know when John Newton wrote Amazing Grace, how sweet the sound. It was when he heard the call of the sound of God's grace that he was awakened. And believers ever since have been singing of amazing grace, summoning grace, as God calls the sinner to himself.